I'm Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today, we have a very special guest, Ian Johnson, the Pulitzer-prize winning author, journalist, teacher, and researcher. He's been a keen observer of China. He has been in and out of China since the 1980s when he studied abroad there. He's worked as a journalist with a variety of newspapers and other media outlets. He contributes to the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker. You're actually working right now on a piece for the New Yorker, right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm writing a piece right now in the New Yorker about a writer in China.
You're in New York now, but you're going to be soon heading to Germany. And in September, you'll be working at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Berlin on the Chinese state's efforts to co-opt traditional faith and values.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Um, Ian, it's fantastic to have you here. You're one of the top names in terms of or journalism on China. I read your book Wild Grass way back in I think 2008, 2009, and you've published since then several books. Souls of China. You just published in 2023, I believe, Sparks. Uh,
Yes. Right.
it's a look at unofficial historians. Thank you so much for being willing to come on the show. It's a
Yeah,
real
it's my
honor.
pleasure. No, it's great. I look forward to talking.
Could you tell us a little bit about why you wanted to tackle this topic of you use different language, underground historian, unofficial historian, Jianghu historian. What motivated you to pursue this topic?
Earlier on in my career, I was more interested or just sort of interested. I thought I was not interested in Chinese intellectuals, and I only wanted to know about grassroots China. But as I began to spend, when I went back to China, especially after the Summer Olympics in '08, I was away from China for a while, from '01 till '07, '08, roughly. I had a bit of trouble getting a visa to go back to China, but eventually, because of writing about Falun Gong, but eventually I did get back in full time starting at the beginning of '09. I went back to a couple times in '07, '08, and I began this Q&A series for the New York Review of Books called Talking About China. And one of the topics that came up over and over again was this search for history. And I went back to China thinking I mainly wanted to write this book on religion in China, which I did. You mentioned it, the 2017 book, The Souls of China. But then this idea of history centrality and these intellectuals' battle for it was really interesting to me. And I think it was also interesting because it wasn't just intellectuals, it was also a grassroots movement. So I, yeah, I did struggle for the exact terminology. In Chinese, it's a bit easier because you can use the word minjian, which could be translated as unofficial or folk or something like that. I called it underground. I mean, obviously, there's a Chinese word for underground, 地下, but I used underground because I thought in English, it captured the asymmetrical battle between these people and the state. And it also called them underground historians. I mean, they're not all PhDs in history, but I try to define the term very broadly. So it's anybody who's grappling with history in China. It could be journalists, independent filmmakers, bloggers, and PhDs in history. So it's a wide variety of people on the spectrum of educational levels, including some people who I think basically just has a chuzhong, like a middle school education, quite autodidactic, and again, people who are trained. So that's what motivated me and why I grappled with this because I just thought it was one of those topics that was central and which in some ways maybe wasn't being given its due in the West, especially over the past few years as we've come to see China as completely bereft of any independent thinking, a totalitarian dictatorship. I mean, people are using these terms, as bad as since the Cultural Revolution and all these terms, which I think is a bit hyperbolic, but I wanted to show that there is independent thought in China, even in Xi Jinping's China.
You talk about a list of maybe five or six, I'll call them characters, but they're real historical personages. Ai Xiaoming, Jiang Shui, Hu Jie, Wu Di, Han Hecheng, and Tiger Temple. Ai Xiaoming, I thought was one of the most fascinating. She is a documentary filmmaker. She's going to the Jiabianguo labor camp and a variety of other places. She's a self-taught filmmaker. She studied in at the University of the South in Swanee, Tennessee. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And sort of taught herself filmmaking just by watching other documentary filmmakers. Tell us about Ai Xiaoming.
Well, Ai Xiaoming is well known as a feminist scholar. There's a oral history, I think, of feminism in China, interviews with people. I think it's held at the University of Michigan. Somebody must have got a grant to go to China and interview a bunch of people. And Ai Xiaoming's one of the people who were
Hmm.
interviewed. And it's quite an interesting interview with her. I believe that's still available online. And so she started from that perspective, and when she came back from the University of the South, this was in the late 90s, she brought with her also the manuscript for the Vagina Monologues, and she translated it into Chinese and had her students at Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou perform it. And she then got a her friend, this independent filmmaker, maybe the best known independent filmmaker in China, Hu Jie, who'd made a few really outstanding films, to come down and make a documentary film about the students making the vagina monologues, because she thought this is pretty interesting. It's sort of historic in some ways or whatever. It would just be interesting to make a film about it. She saw the way he was making the film and she thought, I am so interested in film. I could probably do this too. So she ended up making the film with him and then almost apprenticing with him for the next few films that she made. The two of them have joint credit on a few films that she made, a bit shorter films that she made. I say shorter in the sense of 30 minutes, 45-minute films, before going off completely on her own and making longer films, including a very long, ambitious film. I think one of the interesting points about her is that she sees herself as this very serious filmmaker, and she's very, like, a lot of these people are very ambitious, and she, as you mentioned, she put herself on a crash course at the University of the South in Western or global film. She dissected films like Showa and Hotel Terminus to find out, how did they make it? Why did they put the camera in this way or that way? What were they trying to achieve? And she learned, I think, a lot from them. And her film on the Jiabiango labor camp is about 4.5 hours long. And I would put it on a par with those kind of films. I mean, I'm not a film scholar or a film critic. I can't really say what's better. You have to also think, not to cut these people slack or something like that, but these are films made under a lot more trying circumstances. These are films that are not made with the benefit of production support, etc. Their films, they are a bit raw and rough, but I think she sees herself in a line with this part of a global conversation about memory, recapturing the past, trying to make visible invisible histories. And she's part of this overall global conversation, I think, about the past and memory.
There's a part in Sparks where you talk about how she is approaching this area that's being guarded by these very poorly paid guards, and in at the Jiabianguo camp, and they've made this area kind of off limits, but they're not guarding it very well. And she tells the guard, I'm going to come over here. And then she evokes the ancestors. She says, these people who died here are our ancestors, which I found really fascinating because one of the things about writing history in China is it's always about the ancestors. I mean, if you think about Sima Qian, who you reference throughout the book, he says he's writing it because of his father. He wants to complete his father's work. And there's some evidence that actually, the first Chinese writing was mostly written not to other people, but the Jiaguwen, the oracle bones, were actually not written to an audience on Earth, but they were written to the ancestors. So this evocation of the ancestors in this contemporary time period, it fascinated me how much of that thinking, this discourse of the ancestor, is driving these underground historians that you were interviewing.
Yeah, I think there's two parts to that. One is they do see themselves as part of this tradition of going back to classical China, or whatever you want to call it, traditional China, the Jianghu tradition of outsiders who are challenging the state, and they see themselves in the tradition of this Yesh, or these independent, wild, historians who are not part of the state system. So they see themselves as part of that lineage. This movement maybe got its start. I would date it to the late 1990s with the advent of simple digital technology, one of the magazines, which I became the title of my book, Sparks, was recreated because people had photos of it and they could then make a PDF out of it. And this was electrifying to people. So the film critic, Cui Wei-ping, she wrote when she read this, she says, now we have our lineage. And this is quite, I think, electrifying for the people because they realize that they are part of a tradition of people trying to figure out what's gone wrong with the People's Republic of China, why it's been so consistently authoritarian over the decades. So this empowers them on two levels. One is the immediate connection to people over the past decades that they can now read their works, they can now make works about them, and so on. And also the more ancient past. I think that's also quite important to them because the ancient past makes them realize that those people are the people who are the heroes of Chinese history, right? Sima Qian is the hero. It's not the emperor who had him castrated, right? It's the underdog who wins. Just like in many cultures, right? It's right defeats might. I think that that's a inspiring thing, especially when you're in a time like now in China where you feel under the gun, you're under a lot of pressure. It seems somewhat hopeless to some degree. You're playing the long game. And I think that's probably how a lot of them see it right now.
Do they, when they were talking with you, did they evoke the names of Sima Qian when talking about what they did? Did they evoke Sudongpo? Did they say, I am doing this like them?
Sometimes. The term that came up over and over again, I think, would be Jianghu. So this idea of the rivers and lakes. So
Mm-hmm.
these can be somebody like Robin Hood, or it could be a person. It's a bit of an outlaw, like the
Mm-hmm.
classic novel Outlaws of the Marsh. Those kind of people who are, even though they're on the edges of society and they may be seen as hooligans or something like that, but they are ultimately upholding the higher values of society that the current government has lost. So maybe the emperor or the king is not following the proper traditions and the proper values, but they are. And by the same token, the people today feel that they're upholding the true values of traditional Chinese civilization or socialism, depending on their ideological viewpoint and when they were writing and so on, that the government has lost somehow along the way.
Do any of the contemporary writers that you encountered evoke, like, think what they're doing is like making socialism right? I know that the folks who did the journal Sparks, they definitely saw themselves as saying, okay, we're correcting this government that's gone wrong and we're getting it back on the socialist path, if I remember correctly. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I think that's right for Sparks. Of course, that was that generation. The
Sure, that's
magazine was founded.
1960.
It was 1960, so they still could sort of think, well, we're inspired by socialism, by communism, and the past 11, 12 years, something's gone wrong. For people today, I don't think there are many people dare to hope for the end of the CCP. I mean, I think that's so improbable and so far off that I don't think most people sort of go there, except for maybe people who are really much more on the dissident end of the spectrum. But I do think that they wish to somehow bring back a more, at the very least, to bring back a more open PRC, the kind of PRC that you might have seen at the beginning of the reform period in the 1980s, say under the Reformist Party Secretary Hu Yaobang, when a discussion of the past was encouraged. And they understand that there were reformers in the party over the decades. Even Xi Jinping's father, Xi Zhongxun, was one of those people who endorsed a critical uh, look at the past. But I think they want to go back to something more like that.
The book Souls of China, you talk about how Westerners sometimes completely misunderstand Chinese religion because of the vocabulary that they have to talk about it. So they'll ask people about their zongjiao, their religion. But if you talk to Chinese folks about their xinyang, their beliefs, their faith, it's actually a lot more fruitful. I was wondering, with Sparks and these unofficial historians, do we, outside of China, do we need a new vocabulary to think about what's going on in China? Because you point out, a lot of these people aren't necessarily what we would qualify as dissident writers. I mean, we're drawing off of this Soviet kind of language, or this language that's inspired by the disagreements between intellectuals in the Soviet Union and the Soviet state. You have samizdat, you have dissident, but Fang Fang herself, you mentioned her in the book. She's of course most famous for Wuhan Diaries, but she published a novel. She's state sponsored, right? She
Yeah.
lives in a state apartment.
Yeah, no, Fang Fang maybe has been pushed more toward the dissident end of the spectrum because of the way the government has moved the goalposts. So things that would have been okay before are now getting to be less okay. But no, very much, I try to make the point that these people are somewhat inside the system and outside the system. In Chinese, qi zhi nei and qi zhi wai, they are qi zhi nei, so they're inside the system. That many of them, like Ai Xiaoming, she retired and still has a pension from Zhongshan University, held a normal kind of job, so to speak. And I think there are many people, they aren't all dissidents for sure. I tried to avoid that word. That's one of the
Yeah.
reasons for saying, underground historians or something like that.
Yeah, sorry, that was
Dissident,
me.
I'm sorry.
And that was me who used that word. I shouldn't have
No, 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 no,
voiced it.
no, no. I think it's useful to some degree. And I think the comparison to the Soviet Union or to the East Bloc is also useful. I use at times that because it's something that at least people of a certain generation in the West can relate to. And it is something that I do find and this but somewhat annoying in that a generation ago, people were familiar with those figures from the Central and Eastern Europe, these famous writers like Solzhenitsyn and Kundera, filmmaker Milos Forman, and so on, in a way that we aren't familiar with the Chinese today. And so sometimes I evoke that to sort of say, these are similar to those kind of people, because I think one of the things I try to do in my writing is try to de-exoticize China. And in this case, I want to show that these people aren't so strange from our own culture's experiences, and that they are maybe part of a tradition that we can understand from European history, from recent European history as well, but also in contemporary intellectual history.
One of the things I find so difficult teaching Chinese literature is that exoticism that's kind of China is branded with. Why do you think that Chinese literature historians, all of China is branded with that exoticism? And I guess a follow-up question is, can we do anything to fix that? I guess part of what you're doing to fix that is writing books like this, but is there anything else?
Well, I think one thing we can do is to realize that they're part of our intellectual world, our intellectual conversations today. You mentioned Fang Fang, who is a state writer. She was head of the Writers Association in Hubei province, I believe, and she was maybe on the National Writers Association board of directors or whatever they call it, before being removed from those positions after Wuhan Diary. But she is definitely inside the system. But I think that people like that, for example, are not so far from our concerns. There's a university professor here in the United States at Columbia University called Sadia Hartman, and she writes about the enslaved person's voice by doing all historical research possible and then making the leap using fiction to sort of make the leap into that person's mindset. Because, of course, we don't have diaries or interviews with people who actually made the journey across the Atlantic, right? So she's trying to find a way to humanize these people. And she calls that critical fabulations. This is her sort of concept for what she does. And she's written about this very eloquently in essays. And I think Fang Fang is in some ways doing something similar. She wrote a book that's being published later this year in September called Soft Burial, about the campaign against so-called landlords, which was a seminal campaign, which people often forget. I think in the West, we overweight the Cultural Revolution as like this one amazingly terrible event, but it was actually the regime consolidated power and much earlier than that, and it made the Cultural Revolution possible through several campaigns before that. And one of them was the campaign against landlords, and the landlords were actually small landholding gentry. So in Chinese, the word shi, who were the educated elite, sometimes translated as the literati, who sort of ran local society in traditional China, however you want to define that. And so the campaign against landlords was important because if you want to bring in this new system, you have to eliminate the people who are running the old system. And this was a way of eliminating all those people. So about 2 million people were killed in this campaign in the late 40s and early 50s. And the party would caricature them as sort of fat cat capitalists, as if they all had thousands of acres of land. And on average, most of them had less than an acre of land. I mean, it was
Hmm.
terribly small land holdings, but any land holding at all made you a landlord. This campaign has been largely erased, and sort of maybe you can think of it as the original sin or something of this of the PRC. It's one of these topics that's very is not discussed that much in China. Not like the Cultural Revolution, which actually up until recently you could discuss quite openly because it was sort of okay in the reform era to talk about the Cultural Revolution. But so Fang Fang writes this book, which is about soft burial, and the idea is a soft burial is a burial where there's no coffins, where there's so many people dying that you just dig pits and basically throw bodies in. Of course, it's the idea also of the burial of memory, and she does this through a lot of interviews, a lot of work that she did in the field. And then she creates these characters who are very believable. It's a very subtle, sophisticated book. I'm really excited that it is being finally translated into English. It's being done by Michael Berry at UCLA, who's done the translation. But I think, thinking of these people and putting her on a panel, for example, with Saidiya Hartman would be really interesting. And rather than thinking that she's on planet China, off in some other solar system that we can sometimes go if we take a space shuttle to get to, that they're also part of what's going on here. I mean, history is of great concern to Americans also,
Hmm.
and to all people around the world. So we should try to bring them over for discussions, make them fellows at universities, have film festivals that feature their work, and so on and so forth, to make them part of our conversation. And I do recognize there's problems. Practically no one I write about in the book is really fluent in English, so it's not going to be easy for Fang Fang to give a public lecture or something like that. But I think with a bit of effort, it can be done.
The term "jianghu" that you use, so it's definitely this kind of underground Robin Hood sense, but there's also the sense of lawlessness in a kind of violent way. They're really like in Shui Hu Zhuan, you have two, I forget the names, but there's one guy who ends up being kind of more state oriented and one guy who ends up being more of a bandit. Is there any sense of I hate to use the term, but revolutionary sense of like things really have to absolutely change right now in these characters? When I was reading Sparks, I didn't feel I felt like they were kind of underground is a great term because they're biding their time. I think that was the phrase you used. But is there any sense that there's anything beyond that? Like, they're not calling for the downfall of the CCP at all, right?
There aren't that many. It's a spectrum for sure, but there are not too many of them are overtly political. Because also, I mean, one of the things I wanted to, well, they are overtly political, but they're not overtly calling for the downfall of CCP. I think one of the reasons might be that I purposefully chose people who are active in Xi's China. So I'm trying to find people who are active today inside China. If you're inside China, calling for the overthrow of the CCP is a pretty fast way to get arrested.
Yeah.
There are more people like that overseas, obviously,
Mhm.
who are more politically active. And although I think one of the points of the book also is there's more and more links now than I think in the past between stuff inside China and outside China. I mean, that's where the book kind of ends with more of this look into how things might go in the future. But I think for most people inside China, the overthrow of the CCP is so improbable or impossible to imagine that it may be a dream. It would be like saying, if you had $10 million, what would you do with it? Well, yeah, I could think of all these things I could do with it, but what's the point of thinking about it because I don't have it. So I think for most people, it would be great if they could just have a little bit more freedom, just a little bit more latitude given to them, and that would be a start. So these things could be discussed a little more openly. But yeah, I think it's fair to say, especially under C, that there are more people who think the system is unreformable, and this is maybe where people are going. That I think it does, as we were saying with Fang Fang. Here's somebody who was in the State Writers Association. Now they've kind of pushed her into the dissident camp, kind of, right? Because they don't allow that. The party used to allow, there were people like Liu Binyan who had who were still loyal to the CCP and who were trying to reform things by exposing problems inside the system, but with the idea of trying to make the system better. Now the party is doesn't allow that as much as in the past. So maybe it does push people more into the dissident camp.
So when I was thinking about that question, one thing I was thinking about is Mo Yan. Mo Yan was, I think, the 2012 Nobel Prize winner, the first Chinese person to win the Nobel Prize who was acknowledged by the state. You had this kind of celebration of him as a writer of China achieving its Nobel glory that it deserved. But today, and Mo Yan hasn't changed himself, but he's being regarded in this sort of dissident sense, in that you have, I forget his name, I haven't talked about it on the podcast, but he's being sued for 1.4 billion renminbi. That's 1 yuan per person, because his books, I think it was Red Sorghum that was referenced in the lawsuit. It wasn't negative enough on the Japanese, and thus it was an insult to the Chinese people. So this person is suing him for 1 yuan for every Chinese person in existence. It seems like there's been a turn. I don't know if it's just the state. It also seems like the population in China on the ground has turned and become more nationalistic, and that's making some of these writers who were not at all dissidents. I mean, when Mo Yan was given the Nobel Prize, he was criticized in the West for being too close to the Chinese state, and now there are folks in the Chinese state who are saying he's, not close enough. It's interesting how this has switched just in the last decade.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the party has created such a climate that there are people who are suing and who are quite nationalistic. For example, the great independent history journal China Through the Ages, Yanhuang Chunqiu, that magazine was gutted essentially in 2016 when they removed the editors and turned it into just sort of this loyal magazine. One of the catalysts for that was a lawsuit filed on behalf of family members who felt insulted that their ancestors who were being critiqued in this article were somehow that they were defamed. And so this lawsuit was by family members, but I think, on the one hand, they may have been put up to it by the state, but I think there could also be many people who just legitimately feel that this is not allowed anymore because they've been taught for so long that it's not allowed, that they may just believe that it's defaming or hurting the feelings of the Chinese people. Like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs used to always complain about that.
Mm. So we've talked about Ai Xiaoming. Tell me a bit more about the story of Jiang Shui. I mean, she was actually, so when we first met, she was at the panel at AAS in Seattle just in March. Um, Tell me, she kind of is the one who discovered sparks. Is that
No,
or she?
she was actually, other people had written about it, and one day a professor came to her to visit her in Xi'an and said, "Oh, you're from Tianshui, aren't you? Don't you know about sparks?" And she said, "No, I haven't heard of it." And so he goes back to his hotel room, and again, the power of the PDF, he just emails her this 500-page PDF with all the material on it, and boom, she gets all this information, begins to read it, and then writes a very long nonfiction article on Sparks for the Hong Kong magazine Jintian, and she then goes and re-interviews people, which creates new historical knowledge. She gets people to go on film, and she creates some moral or history that way. And more recently, she's been in touch with one of the survivors of Sparks, who's now an old gentleman, 88 years old, and he's written down his memoirs. And along with this project that I'm working on called the China Unofficial Archives, we're publishing the memoir. So she's been very much involved in helping to keep this alive. She learned about the other side of China, let's say, through her family. Many Chinese families, which is probably true around the world, that the parents try to shield the children from the unhappy memories of the past I guess different cultures deal with things in different ways. But they often, I think, probably the most typical way in Chinese families is just not to talk to the children about what had happened before because they don't want to burden them. And then also because you're still living in the same system, you don't want to turn the kid against the system because it's going to poison their life if they hate the system in which they still have to live. So the for Jiang Shui, though, her grandfather sacrificed himself during the Great Famine so that the rest of the family could survive. And her father took the family up to his grave behind in the hills of Tianshui. And before on Chinese New Year, before they had their big feast, of dumplings and all that stuff, they would always go up there and give him a bowl to eat first. So and they had to kowtow. So that's gonna, as a kid, that's gonna leave an impression on you. So I think that's sort of also intergenerational memory does exist in China, and that's what motivated her. And maybe a point also worth mentioning, you brought up Ai Xiaoming and Zhang Shui. These are the two main characters in the book. And I didn't set out to do this, but the two main characters are female, which I found to be quite, interesting. And I reflected on that and talked about that also with Zhang Shui, who's interested in this, and Ai Xiaoming obviously is a feminist scholar. And I guess there's different ways of looking at why that's the case. But I think probably the most convincing way is that women in Chinese society, especially now under the CCP, they're quite marginalized. There's no women in the Standing Committee of the Politburo. There's no women in the Politburo even. I don't think there's maybe like two women in the whole Central Committee. So if you're
Mm.
looking at yourself as a woman in the Chinese political structure, you're an outsider. And I think that outsider perspective is also often the most productive way of looking at society. I mean, there's this German writer, George Semmel, who wrote about this idea of the outsider, and he was writing about Jews in Germany or in Europe, that they were part of the system, but they were also always kept on the outside a little bit. And well, this is in the 19th century, in the early 20th century. So although they're part of the system, they're also outside the system, and that gives them an interesting perspective on their host country. And I think for women, it might be a similar situation. And this is why you have a large number of women involved in this movement, in addition to these two that I write about in my book.
Yeah, I was struck by how prominent the female voices were. I mean, Mao claims to be a feminist. Some of his earliest writings is on feminism, and I think that at least initially in that early period of the 1950s, you have a fairly progressive state in terms of feminism.
The
Even though you
first
have
law was the marriage law, right?
right,
I believe.
right,
Yeah. So that was an example. Yeah.
it's fascinating how there's been this kind of turn towards a system of morals that evokes Confucianism, even if not, maybe they wouldn't always mention Confucianism, but there is this turn towards a very male-oriented uh, way of doing things that goes back to this long tradition.
Yeah, that may be the degenerating communist ideology that just isn't really there anymore. It's only there sort of in name, but not in practice. And that this allows and sort of patriarchal structures to come back into the structure. But it also is quite noticeable that these authoritarian leaders of today, they all seem to evoke some kind of traditions, and these traditions are often then quite hostile to women, to sexual minorities, to other groups of people who are on the outside. And so you see this, yeah, in Russia, for example, also, or other states like that. So it seems to be part of the way modern authoritarian states work. But I'm not expert enough in those other places to really draw any meaningful parallels, except to sort of have noted that.
In the AAS panel that you did, Guo Jian, who he's done the translation for Tombstone, several important books, along with Stacy Moser. Is that right? Stacy Moser?
Yeah, that's right.
He mentioned something that really struck me. He said, and I'm just quoting my notes here, history is the Chinese religion. That struck me as fairly profound and a good way to think about China and what Chinese folks do when they write stuff down. Like what history is the thing that starts it all. Like history is the first form of writing, and you really don't get fiction until fairly late in the Chinese tradition, much later than in like the Greek tradition or the Indic tradition. Um, Why is history so important for the folks that you were profiling?
Well, I think for them it's so important because it's been also shoved down their throat by the CCP. I mean, the CCP's whole raison d'etre, if you sort of read the official historiography, is to save China, and they saved China. And Xi Jinping, his first public appearance in 2012 was at the National Museum of China at this permanent exhibition, which is still there, I believe. Was there last time I checked, online at least, called "The Road to Rejuvenation," Fuxing Zhilu, and it tells the story of how China was laid low in the 19th century and there were well-meaning patriots, but everyone failed until the CCP came along and put China back on its feet. And, it brought its territorial integrity, fought the US to a standstill in the Korean War, and put the country on the road to prosperity. And like with other national myths, there's some element of truth to this, of course. That after 1949, China did get its territorial integrity back, and the colonies, except for Hong Kong and Macau, were eliminated. And this might have happened anyway because it was sort of the end of the colonial era and so on and so forth. But still, it happened under the CCP's watch, and the Korean War, as horrific as it was and bloody as it was, and so on. When you think of in the context of Chinese history, where for the previous century, China just lost one war after another war, pretty much. Although you could say World War II, at least China didn't collapse, but it kept going at least under Chiang Kai-shek, but it didn't really win. So I think that there's some truth to that. The corollary, of course, to that is that the party keeps power because it's doing such a great job running China. It wasn't just that it saved China in 1949. Why is it in power now, 75 years later? It's in power because it continues to do such a fantastic job. And so that's why you have to continually sort of rewrite history. And I think that role, that importance of history is drummed into every person in China, from in elementary school textbooks, television series, movies, video games, tourist spots, you name it. This role of the party in saving China, the role of history is held up as the reason why the party runs China. And so I think that's why these people challenge them, because this is what the party holds up as its key source of legitimacy. And so it's what they want to, and they want to say, hey, okay, sure, there were some good things, but there was also all this other stuff that you're not talking about.
Ian, this has been a fantastic podcast. Thanks for giving me the chance to interview you and talk with you about the book. Sparks is out right now. Go get it wherever good books are sold. You've also got Wild Grass and The Souls of China. Also, you wanted me to mention the unofficial archives that you're putting together. The web address is Minjian-Dangan1. So that's Minjian dash DANGANGUAN.com
Yeah.
or excuse me,
Yeah.
.org.
Yeah.
I'll put links to those books and to the unofficial archives in the show notes and on the podcast webpage. Ian, thanks so much for coming onto the show.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to talk about it. And yeah, the archive it's a 501(c)(3) charity that we set up, and it's just basically a platform. So if people are interested in some of the people we've talked about, some of the themes and so on, you can find most of these books and magazines and movies, links to them on the website. You can search by creator. So if you want to say, hey, what has Ai Xiaoming done? You can look there under creator, click Ai Xiaoming, and then it sorts out the films that we have of hers. So that's what that's all about.
So if it's a 501(c)(3), can they donate to that? Like, is that
People can
possible?
donate. We haven't yet. We just got it launched. We got a seed money grant to get it going. We haven't actually sort of got a donate button, but if anyone wants, there's a contact thing. If anyone wants to donate money, we can certainly take that. It's tax deductible if you're living in the United States. So
Awesome.
yeah.
Ian, it's been a fantastic hour. Thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks very much for your time, Lee.
I'm Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.